The services, the products, and the relationship with the member needs to change fundamentally.
That's going to really have to change the way superannuation funds approach their members.
I think that the large funds, if they get that right, then it's going to be really good for the nation. If we fumble this away, then it's bad for the nation. It's been the most unbelievable thing for Australia, but it's old now. If we don't reform it and the funds don't reform themselves, then they'll be reformed by competition.
Welcome to the next episode of the CoreData podcast. My name is Alana Devitt and I'm a researcher here specialising in superannuation at CoreData. Today I have our global CEO Andrew Inwood with me, and we are going to be chatting through the kind of upcoming year in superannuation. So last year was a huge year in the superannuation industry. We saw a lot of things come up, a lot of changes, and we think next year and this year is going to be pretty big years. So we're going to have a chat through what we're going to see in 2026, but also in the next 5 to 20 years. So Andrew, when we're talking about superannuation, you mention it all the time around the peaks that we're seeing of people moving through the system and how we're kind of moving through people going from accumulation into more decumulation.
It's a bit more complicated than that, Alana. You're really right on what we're talking about. And the decumulation conversation is one we're having in the UK, in Germany, and in the USA, but it's really pointed here. Australia was a very good importer of people post the Second World War, which meant to us having quite a big bump in our baby boom. Yeah. So the peak of accumulation is really the 3 years that we're in. The 25, 26, 27 is when we get to the peak in what the demographers call the pig in the python, the sort of big lump of people moving through. The challenge with that is that the system which has been set up for the past 20 years for accelerating growth and accumulation now starts to move to accelerating growth and decumulation. And how we deal with that is going to be quite a big challenge, because the services, the products, and the relationship with the member needs to change fundamentally. Accumulation it's not trivial, and we've been really good at it in this country, and we should be really proud of that. But decumulation means we really shift from a product-led business to a service-led business. What's been the challenge about that is that when you're in the process of accumulation, you can work on the large group of people pretty well. You don't really have to think too hard about cohorts because everyone's accumulating. But people are going to do decumulation very, very differently. A few years ago, there was kind of a fantasy in superannuation where you could get down to the segment of one and we're going to serve everyone individually. It's not really true. It can't really be done effectively. People are going to have to work out cohort theory pretty well, and they're going to have to work out what the rules and behaviours of those cohorts are, and they're going to have to service them. If they don't get the service right, Australia is unusual in the world, whereas people switch their retirement company much more than they switch them anywhere else. So this next 20 years is going to be very tricky. Superannuation requires a 20-year view, so a single-year view just isn't going to be enough, and that's really accelerating from now.
Yeah. And I mean, we've all seen that graph that, we publish at a lot of our different research reports, but also you speak to, and you can just see that sort of drop that's happening. But I mean, that's going to really have to change the way superannuation funds approach their members. They're going to have to really switch from the accumulation stage that they got pretty good at to that more decumulation, which ultimately, we've spoken about it before, but is that service piece in retirement.
So this is a really interesting and challenging piece, and there are some superannuation companies which are starting to do this incredibly well. And if you look at the research that I know that you've been running for the last little while, the best possible retirement research, UniSuper has been the standout in terms of working in that space. But they should be, they should be aware that there are people coming pretty quickly. A giant fund is starting to get that really right. There's another one, AMP, which has been a little bit sleepy over the past 7 years. That's really come back, and it's really doing that part really well. They're starting to do well in retirement and the retirement piece. People have written off the retail funds because of the Banking Royal Commission had battered them so badly. But they've emerged phoenix from the fire. Watch the Insignia and MLC funds. They're doing a really good job at that space. It's not a secret. The banks are coming back into this space because they can see the unadvised people pouring into the superannuation landscape with big cash balances and no service provider in the space. Now, banks' brands aren't as strong as the superannuation brands. But what's really strong for them is their service and operational measures. They're incredibly good at running big call centres, running big service centres and touching their customers more frequently and more lightly than the superannuation funds, who just haven't had to spend the billions that the banks have spent in investing in those systems. So to repurpose those banking systems in terms of the superannuation systems, that's coming. And I think they're going to be better at it than you think. I think they're going to start to be the emergent force in that space.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I mean, you mentioned Aware there, and we've seen Aware shoot up in the last 3 or 4 years across all our metrics that we measure, things like trust, likelihood to stay, member satisfaction. But what are they getting right now exactly? Like, what are they doing? What's the strategy?
So Aware about 3 years ago, and I'm not going to talk for them, I'm not particularly close to them, but their leadership changed, and their leadership started to put the member at the centre of all the conversations that they were having. One of the things that you know from the research you're doing, that small funds are very good at having member closeness and manufacturing that. Aware seem to be mimicking a lot of that with really good member communications. They're leading into the digital space. They're being very authentic in their leadership. They have had a big spend on advertising. Let's be honest about that. They've been very clear and simple sorts of advertisements. So they're getting those messages right. At the end of the day, the trust drivers that they're working on seem to have been really resonating very well with their membership. And if you think about trust, it's not a poorly understood metric. It's actually pretty well understood. And you can break it down to authenticity, compliance, benevolence, and kind of predictability. They're being very authentic. They're very compliant. They're getting good at servicing people, and they're highly predictable. And if you can hit those measures, then those numbers are going to start to move. Some of the other industry funds haven't been able to deliver in that space, whether it's because of complexity or old systems or the way in which they've worked in it. So they're finding matching those kind of member needs a little bit more problematic. So they have done particularly well. And it's going to be complicated for some of the other funds that are competing in that space because they're a big fund. They've got momentum and they're starting to do a really nice job.
Yeah, and we've seen in the APRA data that came out the flows and the competitive flows, and there's a bit of a switch and a change happening, more of a push towards the retail funds, which is quite interesting.
It's interesting and notable, and there's a small number of people who are doing very well. If you unpick the APRA data from the last quarter of 2025, there's 20 billion in outflows, which on a $4.4 trillion system isn't a huge amount, but it's momentum because the previous quarter there were outflows as well. And the outflows are not going from industry fund to industry fund or not-for-profit fund to not-for-profit fund. They're very clearly going to self-managed super funds and to retail funds. And there's a couple of big drivers in that. One is the service satisfaction piece. People are dissatisfied with the service, so they're shopping for somebody else. And the other one is the advice piece. Every time that someone bumps into an advisor, in 6.6 out of 10 cases, they will go to a retail fund and the advisor will put them in there. And the common reason is the systems are better, or they feel that they're better. That's not always true. It's a feeling. Or that they get better service. And that's demonstrably true in a lot of the cases. The second group, which is really interesting, is this direct piece. The direct piece is growing very quickly, and it's growing very quickly in the self-managed super fund space. Now, superannuation, self-managed super trustees used to be in their late 40s, early 50s. There are people who are doing kind of sprint saving into retirement and using it as a way to avoid tax or to take pleasure from it. Massive hedonistic bias in people doing self-managed super. They do it for pleasure. The new self-managed super trustee is much younger. They're 39. They've been working for 20 years. They've got about $250,000. They're either doing it to save to buy property or to get more exotic investments in their service. And the big winners of that are the direct platforms. So they're younger, they've got a decent amount of money, and they're accessing more interesting investments from everything from property to Bitcoin. You can have your own view on Bitcoin and distributed finance. I mean, I have my view, and it's probably not worth talking about here, but you can tell from my face what I think of it. But I understand why they're doing it. And if you interview them directly, which you and I have, and you say, well, if I lose 100,000 on Bitcoin and it turns into 50,000, then that's not a really big change in my superannuation. But if it turns into $1 million, then it really is. So that, for want of a better word, gambling behaviour inside superannuation is kind of really emerging.
Yeah, and I mean, gambling behaviour is quite interesting, and I suppose that's definitely going to be who views that. One of the things that we've seen and we spoke about, and we've released infographics on it, is around the younger member and what they're seeking. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot come through around why people are switching to either another super fund or else a self-managed fund is that real need for control within superannuation. It's that sort of like they've given up maybe belief in the system. They want to invest in other alternative assets, like crypto, for example.
Unconsciously, you're dealing with quite a big idea with a belief in the system, and belief in the system is dwindling. For some of them, they see, particularly the younger members, they see superannuation in its current form as an old person's idea. It doesn't really reflect their needs in their life and the way in which they're working. The kind of post-Second World War, career steady, income steady, saving steady, post-foundation myth of superannuation, which is the kind of middle 1980s Labor Party-led outcome, that's not really reflecting their lives anymore. Their lives are more fractured. They tend to change jobs more. Their economic certainties aren't the same. So finding a way to effectively to deal the young into the conversation about the superannuation is kind of missing at the moment. Yes, we've got apps. Yes, we've got screens, but we don't have any new big ideas. Now, interestingly, there are some with new big ideas that are emerging that are actually getting the flows.
Yep.
And they're growing very quickly now. And it is a younger cohort that's going there. Probably not super meaningful at the moment, but as that trend continues, that becomes more meaningful and the outcomes become really different. We can't just rely on something being on the screen as a big new idea. It actually has to be a better idea for someone's future. Mm-hmm. Now, I think the superannuation industry, and it is an industry, has the capital, the people, and potentially the will to own that conversation. Yet we seem to be avoiding it, which is interesting to me.
It is. And I mean, those sort of new entrants into the industry is quite an interesting topic and something, we've spoken about before. You've described them as sort of barbarians at the gate, which is a really interesting phase. But, what does that mean? How are they kind of attracting those younger members?
So there's a couple of things to be clear about. And let me be clear that metaphor of barbarians at the gate isn't mine. There's certainly plenty of historians who've written about that in the past. And what it's really referring to is the kind of complete shock of the Roman Empire when the Mongols appeared on their borders and swept through Rome and took it out, because Rome wasn't really defeated by an external enemy, it was defeated by itself. Maybe that metaphor is being stretched a little bit far, but the reality is that the new providers of services are starting to make decent inroads. So some of the ones which are potentially hidden that no one's talking about is the platform entrance into the space.
Absolutely.
And they're doing incredibly well, and they're winning through simple efficiency, simple systems and better outcomes. Their returns aren't better. Their administration systems are potentially newer and potentially more efficient. Their relationship with distribution is more significant. And when I say distribution, that means financial advice, but it's also going to mean workplace distribution and other places where people are conglomerating services. And so they're transparently leaning into that space and leaning into technology, and they're going to. The other thing about that is that there are kind of new entrants into the space, and there's some pretty obvious tech companies coming into it. The Australian superannuation system is a massive pool of capital, and it is growing at a fixed rate, and you can map it pretty carefully, and it's always going to be a function of the wages bill in Australia. So if you're an American firm or a British firm or even a Singaporean firm, and I'm not going to give any clues away, but they're all talking and trying to find ways to come to Australia and access these services, then that's very attractive and a great place to be. Unless the firms that we've built up here can start to either partner well or compete well, then they're going to come and take a slice of the pie by simply offering better services and better outcomes while people are potentially kind of catch up. One of the things that I know that you've been working on, and I'll be talking about this in the future, is the way the brands are working in this space. What's happened in some of the bigger brands in Australia is that their trust measures have started to dwindle as they've been unable to match their values and actions gap, and the action of working with them, which is going to be a more common experience rather than just simply leaving them to accumulate, starts to fall away and they can't deliver against those services. And as those brand values start to get to wobble a bit, then the money starts to shift. And capital, when it starts to shift slowly, then very quickly. And so all of these things have to be addressed. There's time to address it. There's certainly the brains to address it, but we can't do nothing in this space. That would be a bad outcome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting what you mentioned about branding because, like that, we've done a good bit of research on this around the correlation between, marketing expenditure and member inflows. And while new members are completely correlated to marketing expenditure, which is a great thing for marketing teams, they're not correlated to that likelihood to stay, so not getting the member to stay. But the newer entrants that you mentioned there, are they getting that marketing piece right? Are they competing for attention and achieving it, or is it it's the service element?
So the incumbents have a couple of places they need to compete. They need to compete with the people who are bringing the money. This is mostly the employers in the place, but they also need to compete in the marketplace. And how they compete about efficacy is really interesting thing. The competition for this idea isn't on free-to-air TV. It's really online now, and working in that space makes it really important to understand. So they are getting their inflows. They're growing very quickly, and double-digit growths month after month after month. It's tending to be direct. This is very attractive to the new players, but going slightly off script, it's also very attractive to the bad actors. I mean, recently in the last quarter of last year, we saw the Shield and First Guardian frauds unwind. They were online strategies. As you know, we did a piece of research letting ourselves go through the fraud and watch how it all happened. It was all direct. It was all online. There was a lot of complicated, and I'm not going to go into it, kind of less than honest messages being delivered through the process, but it was still effective.
Yep.
So this is going to be a really interesting challenge for Australian superannuation system. Big pools of capital always attract bad actors, but it always attracts new good actors as well. So while we get new good technical companies, we're also going to have to play a little bit of defence for the bad actors who are going to be interested in the space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's not even just like the bad actors as well. Like in that piece of research, we also looked at, marketing messages that were being sent out by individual funds and where their members actually mapped them on them meeting those, promises or service messages, and the amount of times they didn't meet what they were pushing out there.
So that kind of what you're talking about is a piece of research which you ran inside the operations, and I encourage people to get in touch with you and understand it. But the values and actions gap between the brands was relatively significant, which I thought was really interesting. I don't think those businesses are lazy. I think that they may have relied on kind of older ideas and old marketing to actually get those messages right, and they haven't been able to match those two things up. So at the heart of all of marketing work and all the way that all businesses develop is a kind of cognitive anchor, and the one word that you stand for, and whether it's quality, whether it's speed, whether it's advice, whether it's luxury, whether it's safety, choosing that word and delivering against it is much more complicated than you think. It is relatively simpler in accumulation when you're just focusing on the idea of price. And we've relied on that a lot in this industry. This is relatively cheap, so therefore it's good, or that we've got a relatively good performance that's good. So in accumulation, that's okay. In decumulation, all of a sudden it's about me and my needs. And the challenge with this, and again, some research you did 2 years ago, which is looking at when the moments of truth happen, where that becomes unbundled so quickly because the service elements don't exist there. Now, if you remember from that research, the one cohort of funds, let's break them up into simple cohorts, the retail funds did pretty well. They were able to solve things very quickly. They were able to move through the system quickly and able to satisfy the members quickly. Some of their industry funds, smaller ones in particular, were able to mimic that and do a very good job and have member closeness and do a great job of it. Some of the larger funds, that was pretty terrible. Yeah. And there were examples of people taking a year or 6 months or 8 months or 10 months to move money. It was more frequently that the files were lost than members. The number of people they were talking to changed, so there was no consistency of service and consistency of outcome. As that rises in frequency, then the trust numbers will start to fall. How that affects decumulation, I don't know. There is a trickiness in the decumulation phase, and we've talked about this and you know about this, the kind of wealth transfer. At the moment in Australia, about 30 cents in every dollar when the wealth transfer window happens stays with the advisor or with the same super fund. And so the money is, for want of an economic term, sticky. it's twice as sticky in the US and twice as sticky, a little bit more than twice as sticky in the UK. I don't remember the mainland Europe numbers off the top of my head, but if we lose that opportunity, then that's a bad outcome for the inheritor, I think, because the keeping consistency of purpose is really good. But if they can't make that work, then that's a big miss. Now, how much is going to be transferred in the next 20 years as we see that kind of demographic curve push through? No one really knows. I mean, it's trillions in housing, it's trillions in small business, and it's trillions in superannuation. Getting that right as a nation is really important. I think that the large funds, if they get that right, then it's going to be really good for the nation. If we fumble this away, then it's bad for the nation.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned the UK and the US there, and what, a topic that has got brought up a lot this year, at the start of this year, because we had colleagues over from our UK and our US teams around advertising within the superannuation. And, they were quite surprised when they landed here at the level of sophistication and depth of the advertising of the superannuation industry in Australia, because it doesn't happen so much in the UK and the US. What do you think? Is that something we should move away from?
No, I think it's really important. I think I think that for want of a better phrase, the laziness that they rely on, particularly in the UK around the pension system, is going to be really interesting. For those of you who don't know, the FCA, which is the Financial Conduct Authority, which is a little bit like a combination of ASIC and APRA, recently it launched a traffic light system in the UK, which is from green to red to tell people that underperforming systems to move around. So that money is going to start to move in that place. People start to realise that they're in a bad outcome. So that's an interesting. I think that will rise in those countries as they face somewhat the same sort of demographic curve to us. Both Mike and Rory were shocked by the ads that they saw on morning television and on the billboards as they came in, that people were advertising in this space. And then when we explained it to them, they absolutely got it. But the challenge for that is that what we've got now is an industry which is addicted to growth, and as it should be, because it should be focused on those things. But I have a very different view of what the growth should be in. There's an idea that the growth should be in member numbers, or it should be in assets under management, or it should be in the lowest price. One of the ideas that we focus on, and one of the purposes behind what we do at CoreData, is that retirement should be just for the best possible retirement for the member. It's the assets under management, how much they're charged to a certain extent is not that relevant. It's how that retirement experience works. Now, let me kind of put this back to you. You've both commissioned and done this research for people, and there are these kind of interesting moments of truth where people are deciding that they're going to retire and they actually have to sort of lean into it. The moment where they start receiving the money, then they have to lean into that. Or commonly when there's been a death or a divorce, who are you seeing who's doing that really well? What's the data telling you?
It's quite interesting, and it's actually quite spaced out in terms of funds. The ones that are doing it really well is personalizing more of their messages. So not only are they kind of recognizing where people are falling in that bucket, they're then incorporating and pushing messages and education designed for that person at those stages. It's also kind of like, especially at some of those more vulnerable moments, like death benefit claims or switching nominations, it's being there at the end of the phone as well as being able to self-serve. And some of the funds have gotten really good at their phone services and have improved that, but are missing the self-service options. Any of the funds that are doing both and allowing the member to have that control, that they can do those quick things whenever they need to, whether that's checking their account balance, changing any of their investment options, but then also still being there when anything goes wrong, when they need that help, and actually having that service and that human element as well is really critical.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, and the data tends to show that very clearly. One of the things that was challenging to me in the research that you're doing, because I was involved in some of the qualitative pieces, is their expectations of the technical skills of the people in their late 70s, early 80s. Send us a fax, take a photo of yourself, prove this is you, go through the personal identification. And often, and this is a terrible thing to say, it's often the wife in the relationship, because men die earlier, and they may not have dealt with this for years. So expecting them to run through the services is pretty problematic. And the funds that have been good at the help are the ones which are really, really good at this. Challenge is that's expensive. building big service teams is expensive. Some of the criticisms that they've had in the past of the banks and the life insurance companies and their service teams is that's incredibly expensive, that's a cost for the member, they're really just a marketing arm. That may well be true, but the cost is borne out in member satisfaction at the end of the day. So it's another way of thinking about that. Yeah. If you were to think about the kind of 3 critical messages that we're getting out of this, and you are running a lot of the research, what are you seeing as the 3 critical messages that you would be leaning into?
Kind of 3 critical things really that funds should be definitely measuring this year and making sure that they have that process in place. They're measuring it, they're getting that feedback loop, they're implementing those changes. Number 1 is going to be retirement outcomes. And, we've seen off the back of the reports ASIC release the sort of response to the retirement income covenant and the lack of response in some cases. So making sure that we're measuring, how we're communicating retirement, how we're servicing those, the outcomes of members in retirement, how prepared and satisfied they are, super critical for the next 5 to 20 years,
20
really
years,
is.
Yeah.
The next one is really member engagement as well. And we both spoke about this last year around how critical that is, because what's happening and what's happened through the system is you've got members who are typically disengaged right all the way with their retirement, right up until they're sort of hit their mid-50s. And then they kind of go, oh, I need to get serious about this. And they know nothing and they don't know how to get in touch with their fund. And it's very frustrating. When you have members engaged from the beginning and you are with them along their life journey, whether that's, helping them know knowledge about purchasing their first home, putting their kids through college, they already are expecting you to be that sort of financial lifelong partner. So that's excellent. Then when they reach retirement, they're already ready. They're already ready for you to partner with them on that journey. And the last one is trust. And this is something you've spoken about loads, but measuring trust with your members, because trust is what actually correlates to members' likelihood to stay in the fund.
It's the hidden integer, isn't it?
It is. It's what really builds that emotional loyalty and makes them stay. You can spend all you want on marketing and get all the members in, but getting them to stay right through their lifetime, right till they get to those big balances, that's the key issue.
So in that trust research, which we'll launch in the next little while, the big integer in that was the most powerful driver, which is the stuff that came out of the MIT in the 1970s, is the concept of benevolence, which doesn't mean giving, it means having aligned beliefs. So the idea that they believe that you're going to act in their best interest is incredibly powerful. Advisors do that naturally and act in someone's best interests. Superannuation funds are building their advice channels, which is great, and I think that's going to make a big difference. But it's a new model and requires a lot more intimacy and a lot more intimacy with members at scale. When they do that, do you think that they can satisfy all of their members' needs, or should they just focus on that retirement need?
I think they can. That's a tough one. They definitely can work towards, satisfying all of their needs, but the retirement one is that real vulnerable stage for their members. And if it's even the case of they start there and they focus there and then move on to the wider journeys. And it's interesting what you say about, them funds really starting to begin to work a lot more with advisors, understand more. And that's going to be something pretty critical for the funds in the next few years as well, is making sure that relationship between advisors and advice within a fund is actually serving members, and funds are really partnering with advisors to service their members.
So that's a really interesting development in the superannuation industry, and I think it's really important. So there's 2 bits to that which are kind of complicated to talk about. In economics and philosophy, there's an idea of this thing called the Overton window, which is a piece of research which in the 1970s came out of America. It was by a guy called Joseph Overton from a think tank, I think the McNeil think tank, where it said that all debate inside a society is something that you can, with the limits of what you can talk about. And the Overton window in terms of what we can talk about as society has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. There's an argument that no great comedy has been written since the 2000s because people just can't have complex conversations anymore. There's an argument too that the complex conversations in superannuation are shrinking and shrinking because of the way in which we want to create a single homogenous mass of the market, that we're kind of all about what the Greeks would call the demos, which is just one group of people, not the atomos, which is the individual. I think that we have to be able to have that conversation inside superannuation about cohorts really well, and that we can't just focus on one cohort, which might be the loudest, which might be the vulnerable, because this is really for everybody. The idea that the rich will be taken care of by advice isn't gelling with me, because there simply aren't enough advisors to service that. There is a need for the funds to be able to serve the misunderstood middle, people with between kind of $500,000 and $2 million. And there's going to be a lot of those in Australia, and they need to be able to find good service in that sort of marketplace. That seems in some ways to be an unpalatable conversation, which is allowing the barbarians in. Having that conversation well is going to be a big deal inside the industry, and the advice piece is the bit that's going to solve that. And having those complex conversations in the marketplace is going to be really important. The challenge with that is that retirement conversation is really tricky. The product inside retirement, we're focusing on a very limited number of providers providing all the retirement income products. And that's going to be a problem, because it's going to lead to a homogenization of the market. Someone's going to have to break ranks and go with some of the new providers. These tend to be coming out of the insurance companies, the Resolution Life or GDG, but we seem to be sitting with the old players because, hey, no one ever gets fired for choosing IBM or Hoover or whatever the case is. But that's going to be a kind of horrible homogenization. The second part about that is that having that retirement conversation is really tricky, but it is meaning that people who have strong brands, and Vanguard's a pretty interesting case in point. This is a very well-trusted brand. It's going to lead into that advisor conversation where advisors don't really want to deal with that. They're going to pass that across to someone who they can really trust. There are other big brands that should be playing in this space. I think Aware should be playing in this space. UniSuper has got a really good case to play in this space. Among others, MLC, I think, has got a really good case to play in this space. But then there's the tiny little super funds. I mean, in the research that we do, and we research so many, it's really unfair, but often the winner of the best performance when it's best customer performance, when it's kind of horses against horses, it's tiny little ones like Ness that do incredibly well. I mean, Ness, no one's ever heard of them. It's the National Electricity Super Scheme. But they have a great call center, and it's too small to measure really, because it's only about $1.5 billion under management, but the service is great, and there's no reason that you wouldn't be with them. Do you think there's a case for fractionalization, or do you think that the big funds just have to get better at servicing at that level?
I think it's the big funds need to get better at servicing. It's like, if the little guys can do it with the limited resources they have, they definitely can do. But we've spoken through so much, that we're going to see in the next year and the next few years. But I would love to hear from you to wrap up, like, the top 3 things that, the funds are going to really need to think about this year and talk about.
In the CoreData, we call this BBI, boring but important, that they're going to have to get really right, which is the systems part of the process. You cannot scale without the systems. I don't think the funds have underinvested in the systems the past time. I think they've taken it really seriously, but the tides have moved so quickly, they've had to sort of cope with this. And moving big fleets is really complicated, but those systems to allow them to scale and to meet the members have to be something that they work on. Matching their brand against the outcome is something they have to take incredibly seriously, because they can no longer just rely on wages growth and employment growth to drive the systems. They actually have to compete for member outcomes. Has to be really important. Developing a series of discrete measures around that so they can understand how they're performing both absolutely against themselves and relatively is really important. One of the common things that I see is that people have only absolute numbers. They only have their own numbers. They don't understand how they're performing relatively, and then get shocked by the outperformance of the others. So we've reached a real turning point in Australia. It's a real turning point, maybe globally, maybe just in superannuation, which we have to talk about. There's a famous demographer who wrote a book called Heroes of the Fourth Turning, who says that what happens in big economies and big systems is that history doesn't echo, but it rhymes. So it kind of repeats itself all the time. And the fourth turning is always about the idea that there is an attack of the elites. It's really happening around the world, right? The systems and the foundation myths which structured the Western economy really echoed since the Second World War. And we've had this kind of liberal Labor democracy all around the world in the economy where they've kind of sort of battered against each other and provided a better system. Now that's starting to fall apart. We have a situation in superannuation in Australia where it was really born in the 1980s, and the foundation myth, which is out of the Campbell report, then delivered by the Hawke-Keating government, and it's been the most unbelievable thing for Australia, but it's old now.
Yeah.
If we don't reform it and the funds don't reform themselves, then they'll be reformed by competition. And that's not necessarily the best way to drive reformation. They should be reforming themselves. So I'd really like them to see them having those challenging conversations now. There's unbelievably smart and effective people inside those organisations. And if we can get their horsepower on the ground, dial the young in to the conversation, because that's going to be really important in the growth phase, and dial the old in terms of the decumulation. Those are the three things. So let's break that down. One is systems and processes to allow them to grow and focus on that. Second is dialing the young in to allow them to be engaged in the system and understand what it means to allow them to save it. The third thing is to be the architects of their own revolution to make that happen. And the fourth is to make that retirement experience really effective. And that's going to be a great outcome, but it's not trivial.
No, absolutely not.
And it's going to require intention and capital.
Yeah. And a bit of innovation maybe as well.
Yeah, innovation. Always that word.
Yeah. Well, Andrew and I have spoken through quite a big, significant piece of the research pieces that we released last year, but also talked through some of the research pieces we are going to have upcoming in the next year. If you have any questions at all on anything we spoke about today or want to get involved in our research in the upcoming years, please get in touch with either myself or Andrew. You can follow us both on LinkedIn or pop us in an email. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks very much for joining me, Andrew.
Great pleasure.